Good day and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rasool, and today we are speaking about female entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and female economic empowerment. Now, we live in one of the most unequal countries in the world, and those most affected by it are women in rural communities. Now, aside from the usual issues such as the gender pay gap and gender bias, women in rural communities are also cut off from labor opportunities at all. After the break, we are going to be speaking to human rights activist and social entrepreneur Khanya Mncwabe, who launched a company called Matawi Mead, which makes a craft beer and a craft gin. And we're going to look at the pathway to creating job opportunities in rural communities. But before that, let's have a look at a short video that shows the importance of economic participation for women in rural communities.
Ek het getrou met 'n man van Leliefontein. Hier het ek die kultuur kom beleef en besef dat ek hou van die kultuur. Dis aangenaam. Ek wil hierdie kultuur laat voortleef en daarom het ek besluit om te begin met 'n kookskerm en die namerite. Kom na Leliefontein en kom ervaar ons tradisie. Jy kan in 'n kookskerm eet. Die kookskerm word gemaak uit bos. Dis 'n tipe vygie en ons pak die kookskerm met die vygie. Kookskerm beteken eintlik kombuis. Want dit is waar ons voorouers hulle kos gemaak het. Die kos wat ons gebruik is uit die veld uit. So mense hou daarvan om heeltemal iets anders te kom ervaar. Ons is heidaglik 6 vrouens. Ons werk baie nou saam. Dis ons besigheid en ons bestuur dit as 'n groep, as een. En dit werk uitstekend. Mense kom en hulle kom slaap in hierdie matjies sit. Ons gebruik 'n tradisionele kommetjie sodat mense hulle kan was daarin en dis 'n belewenis vir die mense. Die riet word in die vlei lande gaan pluk. Dit is omgewingsvriendelik en so dit gaan weer terug na die natuur, want na 'n sekere tyd kan jy nie meer die mat gebruik nie, jy kan nie meer die latte gebruik nie, so alles gaan terug in die natuur in. Ons mense is baie gelukkig. Die mense kry swaar, ons mense het nie regtig inkomstes nie en die kookskerm en die namerite. Dit is 'n werkskepping aan ons gemeenskap. So ons sit brood op die tafels van mense neer. Ons maak staat op die veld om ons kultuur kan laat voortleef. Maar nou kom ek agter dat die weer het verander. Ons het 'n climate change diary gekry van Conservation South Africa. Die climate change diary help ons want nou kan ons werk uiteensit en ons probeer soveel as moontlik om ons werk voor te berei. In die verlede het Leliefontein geen akkommodasie gehad vir toeriste nie, maar nou het ons die kookskerm, ons het die namerite en dan het ons ook die lodge. Vir Conservation South Africa is dit 'n wow. Want was dit nie vir hulle nie, dan was hierdie projek nie moontlik nie. My droom is om die gemeenskap meer en meer werk te gee, sodat ons mense 'n broodjie op hulle tafels kan hê.
That was a short video on women's economic participation in rural communities. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and we are speaking about female entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and female economic empowerment. And I'm so excited to chat to our guest today. We are joined by Khanya Mncwabe. Did I say it correctly? Thank you. And Khanya is the founder or co-founder of Matawi, which is a gin and craft beer company. And you work with women in rural communities to produce this gin. And there's a whole story around this. I think it's going to be very valuable. Khanya, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Lenina. It's good to be here.
So Khanya is also a human rights activist and researcher. And Khanya, I wanted to go into that first before we get into business. Now, during your earlier career as a researcher, you said part of that was visiting rural communities and seeing all of the challenges that they were going through. But the thing that struck you was going back and seeing nothing changing all the time. And you thought that going into business would make a deeper impact. And so to start us off, I want to see what are some of the challenges that women especially face in rural communities in terms of perhaps lack of access, or what are the things that were not changing?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Lenina. As you said, I have worked as a human rights researcher, advocate, activist. And a lot of the work that we did really centered on giving expression, whether it was to the Constitution or to policies, and to make sure that people actually lived out the human rights that they enjoy. But one of my biggest frustrations was that we would go into communities just to consult. What are their lived experiences like? What are the challenges that they experience? And it would be mainly very distant, very remote rural communities. Some of them close to mining activity, so they were very much affected by environmental issues, for example. But with others, it was just a lack of everything, lack of jobs, lack of alternative income sources, lack of access to public education, lack of access to health. But what was most glaring for me was that every community we went to, the women were the most marginalized. So the community itself would be impoverished, but you'd find that men would hold some semblance of a job. But if women had any work at all, it would be on a seasonal basis. And in most circumstances, they didn't even have the agency to have control over their earnings. So it was handed over immediately to husbands. But for me, it was actually, I just reached a point where I felt like I've been pushing paper for long, but every time I go back to those communities, I find people in the same situation, same circumstance. So the laws are getting better. Implementation is improving because there's a lot of pressure for implementation. Policies are getting developed, regulations are getting developed, but they're not trickling down at the pace that I would have wanted to be able to say the work I'm doing is making a change in people's lives. And so I felt, no, man, at least if I'm creating a job opportunity for someone, then I can see the difference. I can say, this effort that I have made has led to someone being able to earn a decent living wage. Yeah.
And I think one of the things you said, and I read in an interview, was that you were visiting sometimes the same community, so you could see the same people with the same issues and nothing actually happening for them over a long time.
Absolutely. I mean, the one example I can give, it wasn't a South African example, but it was a mining community in Zimbabwe. And the people were very clear about what they could see happening. So they knew that companies were getting assigned concession rights, predominantly Chinese and Russian, but they weren't getting employed. And so what they wanted to understand was, why is preference not giving to the neighboring communities? And then, of course, there was very strong sort of securitization of the space. So people no longer had access to the river. They weren't able to sort of move through the space as freely as they could before. They could no longer have access to sort of firewood. So they could really see and understand the systemic and structural constraints that were making their lives worse off. And it was very frustrating. That was a community that we interacted with over 10 years, I think. And you could see things regress. And it was similar in South Africa. Some of the communities that we'd visit in Nelspruit particularly, it was the same. They could see mining companies come in We know they're supposed to create housing for those of us who either are within the supply chain of the company. We know they're supposed to facilitate schooling, and it wasn't happening. And so they were saying, how do we hold them accountable when we don't even have power, you know?
That's a very interesting. And then also looking at, I guess, when you look at the lack of access to education and just understanding formal processes, which is something we speak about a lot here, there might be accountability processes, but they don't have access to what they need in order to put that through.
Exactly. And I think even where people have an understanding, because there is a level of sophistication once you've been interacting with a lot of public interest law groups.
Yes.
They would say to us, so we know that the first port of call, for example, is supposed to be the councillor, but we also know that the councillor is in the pockets of the businesses, so he doesn't want to facilitate us. So we will write a petition, they will refuse to accept it. So as you rightly say, the processes are there, they are known to communities, communities are seeking to activate them, and they're just being blocked on the basis of the power imbalance that exists.
That is such an interesting insight. I'm going to have you back so we can actually talk about that a lot more because it's so important. But I have to just pivot you and go to the business side of things. So you saw all of this happening and you thought, and we know also the issues around economic empowerment, and you mentioned lack of access to jobs, especially for women, right? So there are a whole lot of other constraints, intersectional constraints for women, women in poverty, women in rural communities. And so you took this perspective of human rights and activism and directed that into entrepreneurship. And I want to say social entrepreneurship, but I also wanted to ask that you give us an idea of what social entrepreneurship is before we go in, because I think we use this term a lot, but we don't really understand. So for instance, a mining company who was supposed to provide a school and other resources might term that as social entrepreneurship, but what is it really?
Yeah. So for me, it was very much, you know, I was working on various aspects of human rights, but I also spent a stint working on business and human rights and looking at businesses as social actors. And I think that was where the appreciation for a social impact venture came from. It was recognizing that businesses are profitable entities, which means that they have the means to make a big difference in people's lived realities. So for me, it was very much about responsible business, making sure that I don't just hold myself to sort of the lowest standard. It's making sure that I pay people a living wage, not the bare minimum or the basic wage that is required by the law. It's making sure that we conduct our operations in a way that doesn't harm people or the planet. And then it's making sure that we hold ourselves accountable and we don't just wait for punitive action from the state. And so what we're wanting to pursue, and it's a big priority for Matawi, is making sure that we become fair trade certified so that we have external auditors who come to check our systems to make sure that the claims we're making are actually upheld, that it's not just a case of it's a nice certificate to have on the bottle that looks very shiny, but that they come and they say, okay, are you meeting labor standards? Are you meeting social standards? Are you meeting environmental standards? That's so important to us because we want to take away that power imbalance. So as you said, we work with a lot of rural cooperatives who provide us with the ingredients that we use to make our alcohol brand. But we want to make sure that they also don't have to complain, that it's a regular occurrence to make sure that we're checked to see that we are actually holding ourselves to that standard.
I mean, I love that. I didn't actually know sort of the workings around fair trade. Again, you hear these terms, but you don't 100% understand it. But I mean, thank you so much for bringing that in. And now that you've moved to the product and you spoke about working with cooperatives, I wanted to ask you about that. Now, the brand in itself is, you know, just so wonderful because it ticks so many boxes in terms of social entrepreneurship and working for the community. There is one of the great things you're going to tell us about is the environmental part of it, where it was conceptualized during COVID to use less water. That's one of the aspects. I think the thing I loved reading about most was you use a traditional fermenting or brewing process. I'm not going to try and explain it. But that sounded really lovely. So please tell us a little bit more about that.
So I love getting into this because it really is a passion project and passion product. But Matawi basically means branches in Swahili, and it's because we're inviting conscious consumers to branch out. But we're inviting them to actually experience the oldest known alcoholic beverage in the world, which is mead. So it's alcoholic honey products. And what's so fascinating for me about mead is that it's always associated with the Vikings, but you actually find it in every single culture. So we know from archaeological digs that the Chinese consumed mead in India, in Africa. Here in South Africa, we know it as kari, the sand, that's what they called it. Xhosa communities call it iqhileka. But in Ethiopia, they call it tej. In Kenya, they call it, there's another name for it in Kenya. But so it's a vibrant, old beverage that we're wanting to bring back. And we're drawing on the traditional Xhosa style of mead making and bringing it back and really just reviving that heritage which became lost when grain started getting used for fermentation. But the reason it's an environmental project is because when you're making iqhileka, you just use water and honey for the fermentation. There isn't the need to have the grape on the vine or the wheat growing in the field, so you dispense with months of irrigation. So it really is a water-conserving alternative. And I don't know, Lenina, if you remember, but at the height of our drought in Cape Town, there was a time when we were inching towards day zero, but that was for household taps. The water for the agricultural sector had been ring-fenced. And so what fascinated me when I was researching this was actually recognizing that 70% of the world's water goes towards supporting agricultural output. Only 2% goes towards human consumption. And so within that 70%, we like to think, well, it's growing our food. No, a lot of that is growing the grapes for our wine and the grapes for our champagne. So what we're hoping to do is actually just to drag that amount of water down by actually presenting an alternative that people can know this one actually doesn't dent water to the same extent as other forms of alcohol. And then in terms of the social impact side, as you said, we're working very intentionally with rural youth and rural women. And the reason we've opted to partner with cooperatives is because we want to make sure that people are also working in ways that respect governance principles, that it's a collective, democratic decision making, that people are involved in all of the day-to-day growing of the tea or the florals and botanicals that we use, or even in the beekeeping setup and in the production, to make sure that there's as wide a diffusion of economic benefit as possible.
Amanda, you said something really interesting. So I just want to jump to, you said 70% of our water goes to agriculture and 2% is household. And that made me think of the narrative, not that recycling, you know, everyone should be responsible and recycle, but there's a narrative also emerging that the broader narrative within campaigns is that it's an individual thing. But actually, when we look at the way if businesses would reduce even just a little bit, it would have a broader impact. Absolutely. And is it similar sort of to that?
It's absolutely the case. I mean, I think that as human beings, we know that we're not treating the planet well. We know that we're not respectful, we're not cognizant of the fact that we actually need to be sustainability oriented. So we're working with resources as if they will be replenishable forever, and that's not the case. So I get so frustrated by that narrative that it's sort of individual responsibility and individual choice. Yes, those decisions can make a difference. We saw that in Cape Town. We saw the adjustment in the way that people started reusing their grey water, that it really did make a significant dent, but on the household consumption side. I think when it comes to the agricultural side, there tends to be a conservatism, right? Because there's a fear that you're going to interfere with your bottom line. But I think for me, the motivation for Matawi was that you have to go triple bottom line. It cannot simply be about protecting your profits. You have to be respectful of people and planet to the same extent as well. And so as I said, if 70% is going towards agriculture, Big Agric needs to change the way that they do things. They need to become water wise. They need to become water sensitive. We do need to decrease the amount of meat that we're eating, because a significant amount of that water is also going to livestock rearing. Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit more about the women in rural communities that support and how that was built into your model for female economic empowerment, but also targeting, I would think, groups who have the least, which is the most marginalized.
Yeah, so I mean, the start of the company was just a happy coincidence. I didn't know much about mead making. I just learned that it was water sensitive. And it just so happened that a friend of mine was doing a PhD at the time. And so he was extracting propolis from honey and had a whole lot of this honey. He ended up down the mead rabbit hole, and I happily followed. But one of the things I said to him was that I'm very clear about the fact that what appeals to me about this business is actually the possibility for creating a value chain to create income generating and employment opportunities for the most marginalized. I think in working or in visiting a lot of the rural communities that I mentioned earlier, I recognize that people don't necessarily have the degrees that equip them to participate in the formal job market. But they have a great deal of resilience and they have a great deal of embodied knowledge, right? And so I know that there are people who are engaging in subsistence farming or who are engaging in small scale farming. And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to sort of aggregate that and then make sure that those are my preferred suppliers, that I can actually say, this is where I source my honey, this is where I source my tea. And so we're engaged in several fundraising rounds at the moment to basically make sure that we're not setting people up for failure. We want to capacitate the people that we partner with. We want to make sure that they have been trained, not just in how to be responsible beekeepers, but also in financial literacy, to understand how they keep a tally of the monies that are coming into them, how wages are paid out, what the law says in terms of labor regulations, how dispute resolution can be effected, well, so that we're also not creating a problem in trying to bring good into a society by disrupting it. And so we're wanting to do two things. We're wanting to first draw up a honey map of South Africa, because I think it's incredible how diverse our honeys are just based on the flora that you find in particular areas. You know, in the Western Cape we have a lot of fynbos, a completely different honey to the one that you can find up in the Highveld where it's blue gum and a lot of orange blossom, and then different again when you go to a citrus area or an avocado area. So we really want to map it out so that we're building Iqiliga varietals, but also so that we actually start drilling down into those communities and making sure that we're capacitating as many communities as we can and bringing them into our supply chain. And then the second component of that will be the training, to make sure that people understand what it means to be a cooperative, what does it mean in law, what it means to set up your business account, what it means to engage in democratic decision making, what it means to actually work in a way that trickle economics hopefully becomes possible outside of sort of the regular mold.
Khanya, I love everything that you're saying, and I mean that it's like knowledge transference. We don't need the MBA, it's the informal MBA that allows us to participate into the formal economy, which is what is necessary for both growth and sustainability.
Absolutely, we have to meet communities where they're at. When I was pulling together a lot of the rationale for the funding, you recognize that our unemployment stats might be sitting at a worrying level, but for youth, they sit at 65%.
Yeah.
And so it's not a case of business as usual. It can't be in South Africa.
Khanya, thank you. We are going to take a short break, but we're coming back to continue the conversation after this. Welcome back. You're still watching the Womxn Show, and we are speaking about female entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and female economic empowerment. And with me in studio is Khanya Mncwabe. No, I didn't say it right.
It's Mncwabe.
Mncwabe. I am learning. I am sorry. And we've got Khanya here because Khanya started this really innovative brand. It's a social entrepreneurship initiative. And Khanya, you produce a gin and a craft beer. Now, I want to say that, alcohol is a thriving industry in South Africa. We've seen a few female entrepreneurs sort of coming in over the years. As a woman, and especially as a black woman, I think, I want to ask what the experience has been like for you, and I want to ask, from an entrepreneurial perspective, globally they say that black women still receive the least amount of funding, and so from your experience, how has this been for you?
Yeah. Lenina, I like to say that I'm playing 400-year catch-up, hey? I came to business without a business qualification or business experience, but I knew that I am educated, I am smart, I like to believe, and yet there was so much about this industry that I didn't know, you know? So first it was a case of just wrapping my head around the regulations. That was easy enough to do. That's part and parcel of what I was doing in my former life. But there is so much that actually isn't documented. And I think that was a shock to my system. There are so many companies. I mean, one, we're dealing with two monolithic alcohol companies. You have AB InBev on the one hand, and you have Distel, which has now been taken over by Heineken. And so their size is so considerable on the South African landscape that all of the players who feed into their business model don't need to advertise their services. I mean, those that they're working with, both in terms of with AB InBev, they have their own distribution network, and they have, you know, the drivers who are a part of the business model, who are shareholders within the broader company. But I found when I was looking for even just procurement things, I am so small that I just don't even land on the radar, for example, of the bottle manufacturer. And I was quite clear that I wanted to create a premium brand, so I didn't want to go the console route. I wanted sort of a expensive looking bottle.
Yes.
And I remember, I'll never forget, so you're sort of Googling to find out where can I source bottles, for example. You find the few companies that do advertise their services. I was very graciously received by the MD of the one company, but he laughed when I told him I wanted 100 bottles, and he said to me, "My dear, we sell by the pallet, and a pallet is 1,000 bottles."
Oh, wow.
So the first obstacle, I think, is very much the fact that the projections, the financial projections that I had made were completely off, because I didn't actually understand how the business is structured. And in the Western Cape, it is structured towards wine estates and large-scale producers. So you're looking at exactly, you need to invest in 1,000 bottles. And then it was also just recognizing that, you know, I didn't know the distribution side of the business at all. So I didn't understand, you know, that if you're wanting to go retail, it makes sense to go with a key account manager. It makes sense to go with a national sales fleet. But again, those are costs that you have to build into your expense model that take you into another dimension altogether. So for us, it's been, COVID was a blessing in disguise, actually, because on the one hand, even though we weren't able to trade, we were able to spend that time getting to grips with what the business looks like. And what it meant for me was cultivating a lot of humility. I was just reaching out to people on LinkedIn. I would have the conversations. I would say to them, I'm going to ask stupid questions, just bear with me. I would say to them, I may not even know what questions to ask, please volunteer what I should know. And so it's been a huge learning curve, but it made me realize the obstacles that people are up against because of the fact that we're contending with the legacy of apartheid. We were so excluded from the economy that I didn't understand the extent to which I didn't know what I didn't know, you know? So it's been a huge learning curve, a significant learning curve. But I've been fortunate. There have been people who have been allies. There have been people who have volunteered their information. There have been people who've been kind enough to point me, to open their networks, to point me in the right direction, to facilitate our progress. And so it's meant that I reckon it's the reason that we're still standing after the shock of not being able to trade under lockdown.
Wow, I mean, I want to thank you for being so honest to that answer. I think, I'm finding it personally very valuable, and just speaking about sort of humility and the knocks that you're taking and starting off with sort of wrong assumptions or perceptions. Yeah. And so I want to ask, you know, you laid out this plan, and to me it sounds like, oh, you know, we thought the pathway was going to look like this, and then we just encountered all of these obstacles, and a lot of people would stop sometimes but the first one and say, oh, okay, they don't do 100 bottles, we have to get 1,000, it's just not possible, shelve the idea. What is it, but you kept going.
Yeah.
What is it that brought up for you, and maybe this is a personal question, that, you know, just had you continue asking and following up and going through everything?
I think it's because for the first time I'm not working on an ego project. I'm really working on something that I hope to be a long-standing legacy. I feel a great sense of responsibility to to bring to fruition this idea that I believe in, but not for myself. It really is because I wanted to be able to catalyze as many jobs as possible. And I think because of that sense of responsibility, I've never been so committed to work before, especially where I'm not getting paid for it.
Yeah.
But I just have a great sense, not just of responsibility, but also of joy doing this work because I am learning and because I understand that it is a case of knocking down the barriers. I think that is also a great deal of the satisfaction that I get. And I'm an entrepreneur who doesn't lie about this thing. I see people, I don't detract from their mission of, posting very positive stories. I am brutally frank about how hard this thing is because I don't think that it's fair to give people the impression that it is all smooth sailing. It requires a great deal of grit and gut and determination and a constant reaffirmation and reminder of your why. And so I have it on my wall. I know I know why I'm trying to do this. I know who I'm trying to do it for. I know that I'm unlikely to enjoy the real fruits of it. So I involve my children in many aspects of the business. And I tell them as well, you guys might be the ones to reap the fruits of this business. But it's the same with, when you plant a peach tree. Yeah. It doesn't flower in the first year. You have to wait for it. And so you have to keep nurturing the soil, keep watering it, keep sustaining it, keep feeding it. And that's basically how I stay motivated.
I want to ask you, there's a thread running through this, I think, from the beginning of our interview. Entrepreneurship, or the way that it's portrayed traditionally by media. And I mean, I worked at magazines. I used to write an entrepreneurship page, so I know. It's very individualistic. Yeah. Even in the movies, as I'm watching, they're showing... I love the documentary Madam C.J. Walker on Netflix, but it's very individualistic. And I think that's what makes it hard sometimes for people. People constantly feel like they're failing at it and they're doing that. What I'm picking up here also is that a part of your motivation and the way you tackle this is from a structural perspective. So when you come in and you're saying, I'm coming in with the deficit of 400 years, and the fact that they don't do 100 bottles, they only do 1,000 bottles, and you didn't work. Those are structural things, right? So I think for the entrepreneurs out there who are struggling and think because entrepreneurship is framed as a single person and it's easy to feel like, and I'm just going to say, you come up against 1,000 bottles, and you think, oh my God, I did something wrong, I didn't do my research properly, I'm not cut out for this. I think I'm just asking you to give a frame about what structural barriers look like and why to keep going. You said, knocking down those barriers, and you change things later on. The next person that wants to start something might then have access to a small amount of bottles. I'm being very simplistic, but...
Well, I'm hoping that they'll actually be a part of a collective that's able to buy the 1,000 but share it amongst the smaller producers. Yeah. But you're so right, Lenina, that it really is about those structural, I won't even say barriers, but just those structural norms that are entrenched and that we also just come up against them as if they are normal. I like to say that, the humility, I didn't choose it, but I recognized that it was so necessary because you have to be able to acknowledge the fact that the system was not built for those of us who are coming so far behind the curve, if I can put it that way. But then I also put myself in the shoes of the beneficiaries that I'm wanting to support. And I think to myself, South Africa is very, very regulated. Can you imagine being a woman who's working in Wuppertal and she has to register a company and she's told that it's online? And she has a very low level of literacy. So navigating that portal online is like an impossibility. It's not even a difficulty, it's an impossibility. And then she's told that once you've registered the company, it has to be linked to a business account. And that in order to open the business account, you need to have a proof of address and you need to have the money to deposit in order to open that account. And so...
that's just baseline.
That's just baseline. That's just to get it off the ground. Never mind to incorporate the cooperative. And as soon as I do that, I recognize I do not have it a quarter as difficult as the people that I'm wanting to lift out of the situation that they find themselves in. They didn't choose it. Nobody chooses poverty. We're dealing with a country that was very intentional about how it constructed racialized poverty. And so that is what galvanizes me. And I think to myself, no, heck, I do know how to navigate that portal. And I do know how to open the business account. And I do know how to write a grant proposal. And I do know how to soldier on. And I do have the networks. And I do have the contacts. And I do have the LinkedIn if I want to stalk and ask people the questions.
Yeah.
So it then becomes, what galvanizes me, that I actually don't have the luxury of sitting on my coattails and crying as an individual who has failed, because it actually isn't about me. It's about this generation and setting things to right if we want to inch closer to the vision of the South Africa that we want to achieve.
Yeah, and doing it even just one question and one person at a time, right? Because that's how we sort of build the momentum. I mean, I think that's wonderful, and it's taking me a little bit into my next question, because I did stalk you, as I said, and I came across a wonderful speech, or it was an article about a speech that you gave at Bridja School or College, which I think is where you attended.
No.
Oh, so it was just...
No, I'll contextualize that one for you.
But in the article it said that you grew up in a rural community, and so there is a sort of personal... there's a personal link to that, in that personal understanding in terms of where the people that you are, the cooperatives that you are targeting is. And it resonates a lot with me because it gives us a deeper understanding. It's not just, the customers or, let's go into this community. And I just want to read, because you said that certain childhood experiences that you have had still have a strong influence on your thinking today. And I'm pulling that out because on top of the question that you've just answered, when I speak to women entrepreneurs who come into the show often, we also speak a lot about imposter syndrome. We speak about the ways that where we came from affect how we interact, or the questions we're allowed to ask. I love that you said you warn people that you're going to ask stupid questions, whereas the thought that a question might be stupid often stops women from asking that question. In fact, I encounter it a lot, like bold, amazing, trailblazing women who sometimes, take a step back and are too afraid to actually come and talk about themselves and come onto the show and talk about their work. And so I wanted to ask you just about some lessons and insights from your childhood to now that sort of help you to stay grounded.
Sure. So my father was an Anglican priest. My late father was an Anglican priest, which meant that we moved around a lot. And I was born in Pietermaritzburg. My parents worked for the Lay Ecumenical Center there. But at the age of about 2 or 3, we spent a lot of time in Elim, in close to Limpopo. And it was a fantastic time for me. My father was a priest, but my mom was working as a community development practitioner. And so she was working in a lot of economic development initiatives with women. And this one in Elim, it centered on women who, they did textile printing, and they did a lot of sort of tablecloths, tray covers, but there was also women who were working with clay, right? It was so rural, it was so far in the sticks, and so it was really linking the beautiful work that they did, but bringing it to a market where they could actually get a fair price for what they were generating. I was too young to understand it, but obviously as I grew, I came to understand that that was what they were doing. But living there at that age was so seminal for me because it was mainly women who were involved in a lot of the craft work. They work collectively. So what I'm wanting to achieve now is what I saw my mother working towards in that time. But I think what it really opened my eyes to is the fact that almost all of those women didn't read. We would have basically classified them as illiterate. But they were incredible. They were phenomenally smart. They knew what designs they wanted to make, they knew what colors they wanted to bring together, they knew the design capsule to produce, and it was beautiful work. And so I think it was modeled to me that there is knowledge that lives in cultural ways that is invisible, I think, to a lot of us, sort of, in terms of the indicators that we like to use as contemporary society. And so the speech that you were referencing at Bridge House, a little bit of the work that I do has really been engaging schools on how are they transforming? How are they creating schools that foster belonging? How are they meeting and reaching the children who come into that space, recognizing the inherent value that is in every child and really bringing it out of them in a way that doesn't just give them an elite education, but that inculcates a sense of social responsibility as well, so that they leave the school knowing there is something that I can also give back to society. I have skills and talents that that can make a difference. It's not just about driving a flashy car and living in a pristine context, and that if I want to live in a society that isn't as rife with crime, that doesn't have me enjoying a Camps Bay life at the same time as a child in Khayelitsha, their home is flooded or it goes up in fire every time there's some kind of ruction. So those lessons from my childhood, my parents were incredibly socially engaged and involved, almost to their own financial detriment. You know, they felt a sense of vocation about what they were doing, and they instilled that sense of responsibility within me as well, which is that it can't be well with you if you go to bed tonight and you've eaten if your neighbor is going to bed hungry. That you really we need to shift our values, I think, as South Africa.
I mean, I think that's great, and I also love, you know, I always used to think of outside of the curriculum, because when you're talking about this embodied knowledge, and every child also brings that embodied knowledge, and then looking, you know, past our straight-laced, you know, measured A's and B's and so forth. I often love to tell people, I did a speech at my old school the other day as a proud C student. I was just saying, you know, that there's always something extra that we're not seeing because it's not being sort of displayed to us. We have 2 minutes left, Khanya. So I'm going to ask you to end off just with some tips or words of wisdom to all our budding entrepreneurs, or, you know, everybody really that's out there.
Sure, thanks for that, Lenina. So I think the advice that I always give to people is just to start with what you have where you are. Don't be scared. I think we like to overthink things, and we like to think that conditions must be ideal or my knowledge must be perfect. But start. If your skill is making magwinya, start making that magwinya, and just make sure that you cost the ingredients that you use to make it, factor in your labor and your time and the electricity so that you get a fair price in what you bring in. But I think even more importantly is making sure that you draw on the resources. I always tell people that we're living in the most information-rich time. Tap into online resources, read, go to your library, read your newspaper, find out about incubators and accelerators that can train you in a short span of time on the business fundamentals. You know, find out about the grants that are available, but it's often not the money that actually catalyzes people to success. It's having a sound business plan in place. Tap into the business chambers, into the youth development spaces. Utilize all the resources that are there to make sure that you're springboarded to success.
And join the networks.
Absolutely.
I think support is so important with people who understand the journey, and especially can bring you back up when you're feeling down. Khanya, thank you so much. That we are out of time. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Lenina. It's been such a pleasure to share the Matawi story.
We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching the Womxn Show. We are almost at the end of our hour together, and what a great conversation we've been having about entrepreneurship and the different aspects of that. Now, before we go, we are going to have a look at another short video that just carries on speaking about the importance of women's economic participation, especially in rural communities. Let's have a look.
the soil and the earth. That's your peace. Be connected with the soil and the earth and you find peace really.
Zodra jy hier inkom, is op your relaxing moment. It's like you're so comfortable, you're in your own zone. There's nothing else you want to think of. It's just the peace, quietness. It's like you're on another planet.
Toe as ek hier inkom, voel ek gelukkig. Because ek het nooit geweet ek sou eendag my eie basis om my tuin te maak en tuin.
There's a magic in this place. It's actually manifesting in ways that are beyond us or beyond our understanding. There is something incredibly powerful about watching people grow food, and as they grow food and people reward them for growing food, watching that transformative shift happen in them. And that for me is something quite empowering.
When we came here on the 18th of February 2019, we were caterpillars. We went through metamorphosis and now we are butterflies. We are flying. And I don't want to go back into metamorphosis. I would like to stay butterfly. It's not nice to be a caterpillar. From housewives, we became plumbers, builders, farmers, sometimes electricians.
I was a depressed person, and when I started working here, I became more calm. I loved coming to work. I didn't like going to work, the 8 to 5 work on my nerves, working for a boss, oh no. But I can't wait to get up, to actually see the seedling grow. Is there fruit on the tree? That's what keeps me going here.
Dis basically onze mense is goed man. Dit is iets wat onze mense geloor het en vergiet het 500 tot 600 jaar gelede. En as ons nou kyk en vandag sit so wys 500 jaar later as onze mense nie in 'n goeie toestand nie. Especially waar het kom by agriculture. Kos is actually die main basis van baie van ons stress. Van as ek hier vanaand weet ek het kos vanaand vir die potjie, as daar klomp stress op my mind deur die dag. Maar rede wat, daar is die food security nie. Van meestal ons mense hier in die ghettos is under die impression ons moet weg. Ons moet 9 to 5's vang. Ons moet in 'n gebou gaan in 'n factory iets manufacture vir geld. Vir wat is hy geld? Ultimately vir kos. So ek het my gedink dat as ons at least hy chain kan breek waar ons die kospaat van ons stress net 'n bietjie mitigate of kleiner kan maak, dan gaan die ghetto nie meer poverty ken.
We actually thought out of the box into the hook, and we converted the chicken hook into a real cafe, and we called it the Hoenderhoek.
Now, when you have two distinct communities that meet in a space, in a place that is around food, something happens. So now you've got the Khoza, and you've got the Afrikaans coloured, and you've got the white Constantia type, and there's something also quite special in how those three are interacting, because we are all now focused on life and food and biodiversity and health of the planet. And so this farm is part of something much bigger.
Ja, die drink is lekker. Ik wil niet voor jullie zeggen, ze kan bij Ocean View High komen. Langs aan Ocean View High. Het is een lekker restaurant. Hulle noem het OV Organics. En ze gaat comedie voor die hoenderhoek. Zij zal denken ze hoenderhoek, maar wat gebeur in die hoenderhoek is jouw pizza, jouw scone, jouw koffie, jouw thee, jouw morning breakfast, jouw lunch, jouw sappen, jouw koesiste zonneklappen en jouw juice. Die is orange, carrot en mint.
We are 5 female farmers. We are cooperative, so it means it's an equal chain, the business. This is history, because never even in the life and times of Ocean View, you had 5 female farmers. The residents of Ocean View need to claim this, because it is the Ocean View, and we need to connect big time.
Alam ko kay wat na ako sa inyo. Oo, dali alam niyo. Taxi feestjes met een pijp in wala net hier kan kom.
Invest allemaal hier binnen. Hou die geld hier binnen. Ons maak ons self, want ons hou die geld hier, ons kan meer bou op wat ons uitgee.
This is actually a way, an opening for us forward to show them, but there is life here in Ocean View. There is people that want to move forward in life. So I think this is one of the ways to move forward and to get people together in the community to work as one.
It's big, it's enormous, it's gigantic. It's not just going to stop here. People should be able to walk past here and see there's a farm. Because if you think about Ocean View lately, since 2014, all that you hear is crime, shooting, dead body. That abbreviations and adjectives should be gone. It needs to go. They need to talk farm, vegetables, pigs, sheep, goat. So yeah, we are going to make that connection.
I want it to be so amazing. People must even flow over the internet just about this farm. That's how I feel about this farm.
I think through us, Ocean View will be mentioned and will be put back on the radar, because if you go up front and people ask you, where is Ocean View? They think it's in Durban or Sea Point, or you need to say Ocean View next to Scarborough, close to Kommetjie, almost near to Soetwater, where the two oceans meet. But I think this farm is going to put Ocean View on the map.
It's the center of Ocean View. It's the main attraction of Ocean View now.
Yo, laat ons groei as 'n mens, laat ons groei as die grond, laat ons groei om goed te hou in steed van het gooi rond. Laat ek groei as 'n nation, weg van die maatsen, weg van daaglikse stress en alledaagse problems. Gebruik my backyard, waar die backyard om soos 'n bootsie vast te hou aan 'n stuk draad. Nou kan ek opkyk en sê dankie, die ghetto se geld bly in sy sak in steed van die cities. Black and white monopoly, my fokkelie, net as bes op my dak in 'n alibi. Nobody's on duty, food security is a tragedy in Ocean View, liewe ons op 250. Kan niks gesond koek met 'n mufti, R10 brood, heavy process bologna. Syns gaat sikker vir 'n bompie, op bittere wyn van ma of die toppie. Maak je vingers groen met die eens en nollies en sustain jezelf en zet jou kids deur die college. Gaat voer jezelf. Voer jezelf, dat voer jezelf, dat voer jezelf. Moet niet wachten voor de government, maar wacht voor iemand slim. Telegraaf in de verkoop en begin jouw eigen ding. Dat voer jezelf, voer jezelf, voer jezelf, ja.
And that brings us to the end of our show and the conversation that we've been having. Now, there were so many great takeaways, but I think a few things that we can just end off with is, if you are going into a new venture, be willing to ask stupid questions, show humility, and to remember it's not just about profit, but to think about the triple bottom line, which is profit, people, and the planet. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lenina Rasool. Goodbye.